They called her the Gray Ghost, not because she was invisible, but because every time the Japanese thought they'd sunk her, she came back, tougher, louder, and meaner than before. She was a floating city of steel, a fortress that carried the fury of America across the endless blue of the Pacific. Her name was USS Enterprise, CV-6. Before Star Trek ever made that name famous, this Enterprise was already a legend. She wasn't the biggest, she wasn't the newest, but damn, she was the most dangerous thing afloat in World War II. By the end of the war, she'd earned 20 battle stars, more than any other ship in the U.S. Navy. She fought at Pearl Harbor, Midway, Guadalcanal, the Philippine Sea, Leyte Gulf, Okinawa, you name it. She faced kamikazes, torpedoes, typhoons, and hell itself. And she just kept coming. But this story isn't just about a ship. It's about grit, about the men who worked her decks, who woke up every morning knowing the sky could rain death any second, and still loaded those planes, still launched those birds, and still fought like it was their last damn day on Earth. It all started back in 1938. The world was edging toward chaos. Europe was about to explode, and in Asia, Japan was flexing hard. But across the ocean, in a quiet shipyard in Newport News, Virginia, something massive was taking shape. 741 feet of American engineering, fast, sleek, and deadly. She was the Yorktown-class carrier, one of the most advanced ships of her time, and when she was commissioned in May 1938, Captain Newton H. White took command. Her crew was young, many of them kids fresh out of high school, but proud as hell. They called her the Big E, and in just a few short years, that name would become legend. December 7th, 1941. The day that changed everything. Pearl Harbor, a peaceful Sunday morning, turned into a firestorm of chaos. Battleships burning, men fighting for their lives, the Pacific Fleet crippled. But one ship, one crucial ship, wasn't there that morning. The USS Enterprise was out delivering aircraft to Wake Island. When the radio message came through, "Air raid on Pearl Harbor. This is no drill." The Enterprise went full throttle toward the flames. When she arrived, the scene was apocalyptic. Battleships like Arizona and Oklahoma were smoking graves. Oil fires burned across the harbor. Bodies floated in blackened water. The entire Pacific Fleet was wrecked. But the Enterprise survived, and in that survival, she became the spearhead of America's revenge. Within days, her planes were in the sky hunting Japanese subs and striking back. There was no waiting, no hesitation. The Big E was already fighting. She carried Jimmy Doolittle's bombers in that bold Tokyo raid, the first time Japanese civilians realized their empire wasn't untouchable. The message was clear. America was coming. Then came Midway, the battle that would change the entire war. June 1942. The Japanese Navy was on the move. 4 massive carriers, 6 heavy cruisers, and a swarm of destroyers heading straight for Midway Island. They'd crushed everything in their path since Pearl Harbor. The U.S. had only 3 carriers left: Yorktown, Hornet, and the Enterprise. The odds were brutal. But what the Japanese didn't know was that American cryptographers had cracked their code. We knew where they were coming and when. Admiral Raymond Spruance, commanding from the Enterprise, made the call to strike first.
Early on June 4th, the Enterprise launched her dive bombers, those rugged Douglas SBD Dauntless planes, flown by men who looked like kids but had nerves of steel. They climbed into the blinding sun, knowing some wouldn't come back. Hours later, after searching the endless blue, they spotted the Japanese fleet, carriers refueling and rearming planes, decks packed with explosives. It was a perfect, deadly moment. Commander Wade McCluskey led the charge, diving first, his Dauntless screaming down at near 70 degrees. One by one, the Enterprise's squadrons plunged through flak and smoke, releasing bombs at point-blank range. The explosions were so violent they could be felt miles away. In a few minutes, 3 Japanese carriers, Kaga, Akagi, and Soryu, were engulfed in flames. By the end of the day, all 4 enemy carriers were gone. Japan's invincible navy had been shattered. Enterprise limped back to Pearl Harbor scorched and battered, her decks torn up, her crew dead tired. But she was alive. She had done what no one thought possible, turned the tide of the Pacific War. From that moment on, the Big E wasn't just a ship, she was a symbol. Every man in the Navy knew her name. Every enemy pilot feared seeing her on the horizon. She became the heart of the Pacific Fleet, the ship that led the charge in every major offensive that followed. But Midway was only the beginning. The Pacific was a long, brutal road, island by island, battle by battle, and the Enterprise was in the thick of it all. Guadalcanal, Santa Cruz, the endless sea of fire and blood. The enemy would call her the ship that won't die. She'd take direct hits, lose men, lose planes, and still show up at the next fight like nothing happened. The Big E became more than metal. She became myth. But myths are built in blood, and the next few battles would test her like never before. After Midway, the USS Enterprise was no longer just another ship in the fleet. She was the fleet's lucky charm, the one that wouldn't quit, the one everyone wanted in the fight. But war in the Pacific was far from over. If Midway was the turning point, then Guadalcanal was the grind, the fight that would test America's will to the bone. The Japanese were fierce, dug in deep, and determined to hold every inch. Guadalcanal wasn't about glory, it was about survival. The Enterprise was there from day one, covering the Marines as they landed on that hellish jungle island in August 1942. Her planes struck Japanese airfields, pounded supply lines, and fought off swarms of Zeros that came screaming out of the sun. Every day was chaos. Pilots flew until they had nothing left to give, landing on a deck slick with oil, blood, and seawater. The Big E became a floating lifeline. Without her, those Marines would have been cut off and crushed. But glory has a price, and the Japanese weren't about to let her rule the skies without a fight. On August 24, 1942, during the Battle of the Eastern Solomons, the Japanese sent a massive airstrike her way, dozens of bombers and torpedo planes closing in fast. Enterprise's gunners opened up with everything they had: 5-inch cannons, 40mm Bofors, .50 cal machine guns. The sky turned into a wall of steel. But even the best can't stop everything. Bombs hit her deck, fire tore through the hangars, and men were blown overboard. The Big E took it hard, but she didn't go down. The crew fought the flames like demons, sealing off compartments, dragging the wounded to safety, and somehow keeping her afloat. Hours later, she was still steaming, black smoke pouring from her decks, but alive. The Japanese thought she'd been sunk. They reported her destroyed. They had no idea that within weeks she'd be back in action, patched up, and hungry for payback. That's when the nickname started, the Gray Ghost. Every time the Japanese thought she'd sunk her, she came back. And every time she returned, she brought hell with her. By October 1942, she was back for the Battle of the Santa Cruz Islands, one of the most brutal carrier battles of the war. The Americans were outnumbered again. The Japanese came at them in waves, hundreds of aircraft filling the skies. Enterprise's fighters launched to intercept, while her anti-air gunners turned the ship into a thunderstorm of flak. Kamikaze-style dives, bombs exploding, fire everywhere. One Japanese bomb ripped through her deck and detonated below, killing dozens instantly. But the crew didn't panic. They sealed the damage, kept launching planes, and stayed in the fight. When the smoke cleared, the USS Hornet was gone, Yorktown was already lost, and the Enterprise stood alone, the last surviving U.S. carrier in the Pacific. Just one, against the entire Japanese fleet. For weeks, she carried the war alone. Every air raid, every strike, every scrap of American hope, it all rested on her decks. Her pilots slept in their cockpits. Her gunners manned their stations around the clock, and her engineers worked miracles to keep her patched up between missions. One sailor wrote home saying, "If the Big E goes down, we're all screwed." But she never did. The Japanese searched for her constantly, broadcasting radio messages claiming she was sunk. And every time, the Gray Ghost would show up out of nowhere, launching another strike, dropping another wave of bombs, and vanishing back into the mist. By the time 1943 rolled around, Enterprise was exhausted but unbeaten. The crew called her cursed and blessed at the same time. Cursed because she was always sent where it was worst. Blessed because she somehow always made it back. She went in for repairs at Pearl Harbor
And even then, the workers treated her like a living legend. They'd walk her decks quietly, some even saluting her before they left for the day. She'd become more than a ship. She was an icon.
Wherever Marines went ashore, her planes were the first to strike and the last to leave. Her bombers took out airfields, her fighters cleared the skies, and her torpedo planes hunted enemy ships. She'd become a machine of war, precise, relentless, unstoppable. And yet the danger only grew. The Japanese, desperate and furious, started sending their pilots on suicide runs, kamikaze attacks. They didn't care if they lived or died, as long as they took an American ship with them. Enterprise faced wave after wave of these suicide planes, and each one was a nightmare. One by one, they came screaming in low, engines roaring, wings on fire, aiming straight for her flight deck. Some hit, some missed, but every explosion shook the ship to her core. She lost men, good men, and still she kept fighting. By mid-1944, during the Battle of the Philippine Sea, the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, Enterprise's pilots helped destroy over 300 Japanese aircraft in a single day. The Japanese Air Force never recovered from that beating. Enterprise was now officially the most decorated warship in American history. But her story wasn't over yet, not even close. She had one last fight left, Okinawa, 1945. It was chaos. Kamikazes came by the hundreds, and the sea burned day and night. On May 14, one of those planes slammed straight into her flight deck, exploding just aft of the island tower. Fire ripped through the hangars, men were thrown overboard, and for a moment it looked like the Big E was finally finished. But the crew didn't quit. They fought the fires for hours, kept her afloat, and saved her once again. That attack was her last. She was too damaged to continue combat, and the war was finally drawing to an end. When Japan surrendered, the Enterprise came home. She'd fought in nearly every major battle of the Pacific, survived countless attacks, and earned more battle stars than any ship before or since. But there were no parades waiting for her. She was too old, too beaten up. In 1947, the Big E, the Gray Ghost, was decommissioned and eventually scrapped. The men who'd served on her said it felt like losing a friend. Some cried, some couldn't even watch. But her legend didn't die. Every carrier that came after, every ship that bore the name Enterprise, carried her spirit. The Big E wasn't just a warship. She was America's fighting heart, a survivor, a symbol, and the most dangerous damn thing that ever sailed in World War II.
The USS Enterprise may have been built from steel, But her real strength came from the men who called her home. More than 2,000 sailors lived, fought, and bled aboard her decks. And for them, she wasn't just a ship, she was alive. Ask any veteran who served on the Big E, and they'll tell you she had a heartbeat. You could feel it through the deck plates, through the vibrations of her engines, through the constant hum of aircraft launching and landing. She was noisy, she was crowded, and she smelled like fuel, sweat, and salt water. But to her crew, she was heaven and hell wrapped in one. Daily life aboard the Enterprise was a mix of boredom and chaos. When she wasn't under attack, the days were long and repetitive. Men swabbed decks, cleaned guns, loaded bombs, and wrote letters home. The smell of coffee and oil was constant. You'd hear laughter in the mess halls one moment, and the next the alarm would scream, "General quarters! General quarters! All hands man your battle stations!" And instantly the ship would transform. Every corridor filled with boots pounding metal. Every gunner ran to his post. Every pilot sprinted to his plane. The calm was gone, replaced by adrenaline and fear. The men never knew if this alarm would be their last. One pilot, Lieutenant Richard Zeke Rogers, once said, "You didn't think about dying, you just thought about getting back to the deck." The Big E always brought us home. He wasn't wrong. The Enterprise's flight deck became a symbol of hope. Every returning pilot who saw that massive gray deck through the smoke knew he had a chance. The LSOs would wave them in, calm and steady, even as burning planes skidded across the deck. Some landings ended in fireballs, others in cheers. Every single one felt like a victory. Then there were the gunners, the unsung heroes. Those guys barely slept. When the sky filled with enemy planes, they stood exposed, aiming at shadows through the smoke and chaos. Some would fire until their hands blistered and their ears bled from the thunder of their own guns.
There's a story of one gunner who refused to leave his station even after being wounded twice. When they finally dragged him away, he said, "Tell the Japs I'm still watching." That was the kind of grit the Big E was built on. Even the ship's cooks became part of the legend. In between battles, they worked around the clock to feed the crew, thousands of men needing energy to fight. They'd cook with shaking hands as bombs hit nearby, trying to keep everyone moving. One sailor joked, "If we stop eating, we stop fighting." They made bread, soup, and strong black coffee by the gallon. And somehow, even in the middle of hell, they'd find ways to keep morale alive. A little music from a gramophone, a few jokes, and the occasional letter from home. The bond between the men was something words can barely capture. You weren't just fighting for America or freedom. You were fighting for the guy next to you. When the battle alarm sounded, when the deck shook under your feet, when flames tore through the hangar. It wasn't patriotism that kept you going. It was brotherhood. The Big E forged that in every man who served her. And then came the hardest part, saying goodbye. When the war finally ended, the Enterprise returned to New York Harbor in triumph. She was covered in scars, dents, holes, burn marks, every one a reminder of where she'd been and who she'd lost. The sailors lined her rails, some grinning, some crying, as she sailed past the Statue of Liberty. Crowds cheered from the docks, bands played, and for a moment everyone forgot how much it had cost to win. But the victory parades faded fast. The war was over, and the Navy was downsizing. Newer ships were coming, bigger carriers with jet decks and radar systems. The Big E had done her duty, and in 1947 they decommissioned her. For a while, there were plans to turn her into a museum, a floating memorial to the men who'd fought on her decks. But money ran out, interest faded, and by 1958, the unthinkable happened. She was sold for scrap.
Piece by piece, the most decorated ship in U.S. naval history was torn apart. When the news broke, veterans wrote angry letters. One said, "How can they scrap the ship that saved the Pacific?" Another simply said, "It feels like losing an old friend." For the men who had survived her battles, it was personal. Some even drove hundreds of miles to watch her final pieces hauled away, silent, hats in hand. But legends don't die with steel. In 1961, a new ship was born, USS Enterprise, CVN-65, the first nuclear-powered aircraft carrier in the world. She carried the same name, the same fighting spirit, and the same legacy. When the crew of the new Enterprise walked her decks, they knew whose shadow they stood in. And today, that name still lives on, with the future USS Enterprise CVN-80 being built right now for a new generation of sailors. Different times, different wars, but the same indestructible heart. For every man who served on the Big E, her story was more than history. It was memory. The smell of burning oil, the taste of salt, the sound of planes roaring overhead, the sight of the flag waving above the ocean at sunrise. The Enterprise wasn't just a ship that won battles. She was a symbol of what America became when it was cornered, resilient, relentless, and fearless. She took the first punches of the war and threw the last ones back. From the smoke of Pearl Harbor to the surrender of Japan, she was there, always there. When the ocean itself seemed against us, the Big E held the line. And that's why even today, long after her steel is gone, her spirit sails on, in every carrier, every pilot, every sailor who dares to fight the impossible fight. Because ships like the Enterprise don't just fade away. They become legends, carved not in metal, but in memory. The Big E was, and always will be, the most dangerous warship of World War II.
When the USS Enterprise was finally gone, it wasn't just a ship that disappeared. It was a whole chapter of American history slipping into memory. For years after the war, the men who had served on her tried to go back to normal life. Some became mechanics, some farmers, some teachers, and some just drifted. But no matter what they did, the war never really left them. Every sound, every smell, every crack of thunder reminded them of flight deck explosions or the scream of dive bombers. They could still feel the deck rolling beneath their boots, hear the captain's voice over the speakers, and see the horizon lit up with tracer fire. There's a story about one sailor, Chief Petty Officer Robert Red Larson, who worked the hangar deck through most of the war. In an interview decades later, he said, "You don't forget her. The Big E wasn't just a ship. She was our home, our coffin, and our angel all at once. You prayed she'd hold together, and somehow she always did." That sentiment echoed through every reunion of Enterprise veterans. Every few years, they'd gather, older, slower, but still proud, wearing caps embroidered with her name. They'd swap stories over coffee or whiskey, laugh at the pranks, and then go quiet when someone mentioned Santa Cruz or Okinawa. The laughs would fade, and the room would fall into a silence that only those who'd seen war could understand. Even as the world moved on, as television, jet planes, and new wars filled the headlines, the Big E stayed alive in memories and in whispers. Kids who grew up hearing their father's stories could almost picture her, the gray hull cutting through the Pacific, the roaring engines, the smell of cordite and salt. Those kids would grow up and serve on new ships, and many of them requested one assignment more than any other: the new Enterprise, CVN 65. They wanted to stand where their fathers once stood, to be part of the legacy that refused to die. When CVN 65 was launched in 1961, she made history of her own, the first nuclear-powered carrier, a floating city that could circle the globe without refueling. And when the veterans of the original Enterprise were invited to her commissioning ceremony, some cried. They stood on the pier in their faded uniforms, caps in hand, watching the new steel giant slide into the water. And for a moment it was like the past had come alive again. One old gunner said quietly, "The Big E's back, boys. She's still watching over us." Through the Cold War, Vietnam, the Gulf, and beyond, the name Enterprise continued to fly high. She became a symbol, not just of power, but of persistence. Every sailor who stepped aboard her deck knew he was carrying a legacy older than his father, a promise forged in the fire of the Pacific. And that's the thing about legacy. It doesn't fade, it just changes hands. But the story doesn't end there. In 2012, when CVN 65, the nuclear Enterprise, was decommissioned,
The same feeling returned, a mix of pride and loss. Generations of sailors had served under her flag, and once again the name was being retired. But this time something was different. The Navy made a promise. There would be another, a new ship, a new enterprise. Now, in the 21st century, deep inside the Newport News shipbuilding yard, the very same place where the original Big E was born, a new carrier is taking shape. The USS Enterprise, CVN-80, part of the Gerald R. Ford-class supercarriers, will carry her name into a new era. She's bigger, faster, and more advanced than anything the world has ever seen. But when her sailors walk her decks for the first time, they'll be stepping into a legacy that began with a gray steel ship in 1938 and the young men who refused to die quietly. And when that new enterprise sets sail, somewhere out there on the waves, the spirit of the original will still be watching.
The gray ghost will still be whispering through the wind, still echoing through the hum of the engines, still alive in every wave that breaks against the hull. There's something timeless about her name. Enterprise. It means boldness, initiative, determination. It's the essence of what America became in its darkest hour. When everything was on the line, when the world teetered on the edge of chaos, she was the ship that stood up and said, "Not today." She wasn't supposed to survive. She wasn't supposed to win. But she did, again and again, until the war was over. The Big E's legacy isn't measured in steel or stars. It's measured in the hearts of the men who served her, in the families who waited for them, in the stories passed down around kitchen tables and veterans' halls. It's in every sailor who looks out over the ocean and feels that mix of fear and pride, knowing they're part of something bigger. The Big E taught a generation what courage really meant. Not the absence of fear, but the will to keep fighting even when fear consumes you. And that's why all these decades later, when people talk about the greatest warships in history, her name still stands tall. She wasn't the biggest, she wasn't the fastest, but she was the toughest damn thing to ever sail. She was the ship the enemy could never kill, the one that carried the weight of a nation across the Pacific and brought it home again. The USS Enterprise wasn't just a ship. She was America's answer to the impossible, a legend born in fire, carried by heroes and remembered forever. And that, my friends, is the story of the most dangerous American warship of World War II, the USS Enterprise, the ship that refused to die, the crew that refused to quit, and the spirit that refused to fade.
She wasn't just a war machine. She was a heartbeat made of steel and courage, a reminder that no matter how dark the ocean gets, there's always light waiting beyond the horizon. If you felt that story, if it gave you chills, made you proud, or reminded you what real bravery looks like, then don't forget to hit that like button, drop a comment, and subscribe to the channel. Because this is just one chapter in the endless sea of untold stories from World War II. Every week, we dive deeper into the forgotten corners of history, the battles, the men, and the moments that shaped the world we live in today. So stick around, join our growing community of history lovers, and let's keep these stories alive together. This is your storyteller signing off, and as always, thanks for watching. Stay curious, and I'll see you in the next story.